They were arguing about who would get my house while I was still in the next room, alive, stirring the gravy, the steam fogging my glasses as their voices rose and fell like waves against the kitchen wall. I remember the exact moment the laughter turned to calculation. It was my eldest, Richard, who started it, his tone soft and diplomatic, in that way men use when they think they are being reasonable. "Well, when Mom's gone, we'll have to make some practical decisions," he said, and I could almost hear the polite smile forming on his lips. I stood there, ladle in hand, the smell of sage and butter around me, realizing that I was no longer a person in that house, only a placeholder for property, for things, for numbers they could divide. It is a strange sensation to feel invisible in a space that smells like your own cooking, surrounded by people whose faces you once kissed goodnight. I am 82 years old, though I often forget until I see my reflection in the oven door. The woman there has thin hands, yes, but steady ones. She doesn't tremble. She listens. She remembers that Thanksgiving was supposed to be my gift to them, one last warm, familiar gathering before the winter closed in. I had polished the silver, ironed the old linen tablecloth my husband and I bought in Lisbon back in '73, baked 3 pies from scratch. I'd even found the old cranberry dish that had survived every move and argument. I set the table early, each place card written in my own hand, the way my mother used to do. But when they arrived, my 3 children, their spouses, the grandchildren with phones glued to their faces, the house shifted. The air changed. They kissed me out of habit, quick, distracted, as if I were a receptionist checking them into a hotel they no longer liked. I knew, even before I took off my apron, that something in the rhythm of belonging had broken. I could hear it in the way they talked to each other over me, not with me, filling the space with small talk that avoided memory, affection, or anything that might remind them that I had once been the center of this family. Still, I tried. I always try. I asked about school, about jobs, about the new baby, whose photo I'd only seen in text messages. My daughter-in-law, Melissa, smiled with that tightness that meant she wanted me to stop talking. "Oh, she's perfect," she said, her hand brushing her sleek hair as though a compliment might stick to it. "But you don't have to worry yourself with all that. We've got everything handled." That phrase, "we've got everything handled," has followed me for years, as if my existence required management, like a spill or a fragile vase. My youngest, Michael, nodded along, eyes darting toward his wife, waiting for her to cue his next opinion. Only my daughter, Claire, the middle one, looked uncomfortable. She fiddled with her wineglass, the way she used to twist her hair when she was caught lying. I served the turkey myself, slicing carefully, making sure each plate looked cared for. When I asked Richard to pass the gravy boat, he did it without meeting my eyes. They were already halfway into their conversation about the market, about how property values were going up, about the timing of things. I remember thinking how odd it was to hear them talk about houses like investments while sitting inside the one that held their childhood drawings behind the plaster. Their initials still carved faintly into the baseboards. When they were children, this place was their entire world. Christmas mornings, flu seasons, birthdays, and scraped knees all under one roof. Now they spoke about it as if it were a transaction waiting for closure. At one point, I excused myself to the kitchen under the pretext of checking the rolls, though they were already done. I stood there, leaning against the counter, listening through the half-open door. Richard's voice again, calm and managerial. "I mean, obviously the house will go to the 3 of us, but Melissa and I were talking, and it just makes sense for us to handle the sale. Claire doesn't really need another property, and Michael's not practical." There was a short silence, the sound of someone sipping wine, And then Melissa laughed, that small, brittle laugh that sounded like glass being wiped too hard. "Well, we can't wait forever," she said. "The market's strong now. It'd be such a waste to hold on too long." I felt the air leave my body, not like a collapse, but like the quiet deflation of something that has been too patient for too long. I thought of the years that had built this place, the nights of unpaid bills, of patching roofs, of my husband painting walls by flashlight after work, of me taking double shifts at the library to cover the mortgage. The children had grown up in the safety of that effort, and now they spoke of it like an asset to be liquidated. I had no anger yet, only a deep, clean sadness that felt almost peaceful. That's the part they never tell you about betrayal. It doesn't come with shouting or drama. It comes in whispers, at a table where you've set the plates yourself. When I returned to the dining room, they looked up briefly, like students caught passing notes. I smiled and said nothing. I topped off their wine and sat down. The conversation shifted, or tried to. My grandchildren talked about college, about internships, about who had the better smartphone. They were polite enough, but I could tell they didn't know me. To them, I was just a holiday figure, the woman who made the stuffing and smelled like lavender and starch. I watched the flicker of the candlelight across their faces, how young they were, how sure. I wondered if they knew that I once had the same kind of certainty before life taught me that permanence is a myth. Later, when the plates were cleared and everyone was drowsy with food and comfort, I caught a phrase that would stay with me. "We'll sort the will soon enough," Melissa said. "It's not like she's going anywhere this winter." It was meant as a joke, but no one laughed, not even her husband. I folded my napkins slowly, pressing the creases with my thumbs until they were sharp. That was the moment I decided that silence would be my language for the rest of the evening. I carried the leftovers into the kitchen, one dish at a time, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to listen. They thought the closed door made me deaf. Richard mentioned something about a draft document, how he'd already looked it over with someone he knew, how there were minor adjustments that would simplify things later. Claire's voice broke through, hesitant, trembling. "You did what?" But he brushed her off. "Don't be dramatic. It's just practical. We're just organizing." Organizing. That word tasted like metal in my mouth. I stood there with my hands resting on the counter, looking at the reflection of the room in the glass cabinet. My family gathered around the table I had set, debating my worth in square footage and estimated equity. It struck me then that death was not the moment you stop breathing. It's the moment people stop seeing you. By that definition, I'd already died that evening, somewhere between the turkey and the pie. When everyone left, the house fell into the kind of silence that only follows performative love. I moved slowly, collecting wine glasses, scraping plates, wiping crumbs that weren't really there. The clock ticked with a clarity I'd never noticed. I sat down at the table and looked at the empty chairs, each one holding the echo of voices that would never again sound the same to me. I thought about calling someone, an old friend perhaps, but I realized I didn't want to talk. I wanted to witness. I opened the small drawer near the phone where I kept receipts and rubber bands and pulled out the tiny voice recorder my husband once used to dictate notes for his job. It still worked. I set it on the table, pressed the red button, and whispered to no one. "Let's begin." That was the start, not of revenge, but of documentation. Because if they were going to erase me while I was still breathing, I would leave behind a record of the erasure itself. I didn't know yet how it would end. I just knew that the next time my family spoke about me in past tense, I'd make sure they were recorded doing it. And someday, when they came for what they thought was mine, they would discover that the one thing they never really possessed was the truth of who I had become. The next morning began with the same dull November light that always makes everything look a little faded, as if the world itself were tired from pretending to be festive. I woke early, before the house had fully warmed, and wandered into the kitchen wrapped in the old blue robe my husband used to tease me about. The one he said made me look like a faded queen. The table still held traces of last night's feast. Crumbs, a forgotten spoon, a glass with a smudge of lipstick that wasn't mine. I stood there, the smell of wine and gravy lingering in the air, and realized I no longer recognized this space as mine. It was the same house I had built, but it felt like a stage after the actors had gone home, props left scattered, the warmth of the story gone with them. I turned on the kettle and waited for the water to boil, the sound of it filling the silence in a way that was almost comforting. While I waited, I saw something unusual on the counter by the fruit bowl, a small stack of papers half tucked under a folded napkin. It wasn't like Richard to leave anything out of order, especially not documents, but there they were. Crisp, official-looking, printed on ivory paper. The top page was blank, except for the words, Last Will and Testament of Eleanor Mayfield. My name, my full legal name. For a moment, I thought perhaps I'd forgotten that my lawyer had sent me a copy, that maybe I'd printed it and simply left it there absent-mindedly. But when I pulled the papers free, my stomach turned cold. This was not the version I had signed. I knew every line of my own will. I'd written it carefully, word by word, in the months after my husband died. I'd left the house equally to the 3 children, with clear instructions that it was never to be sold before the youngest grandchild turned 21. I'd given them the freedom to live here if they wished, but I wanted it to remain a home, a breathing place for family, not an investment. Yet as I scanned the pages before me, I saw lines rearranged, clauses cut out, entire paragraphs rewritten in a tone that wasn't mine. I sat down slowly, holding the papers flat against the table so my hands wouldn't shake. There, in the neat ink of someone else's pen, were words that turned my life into a ledger. The house was to be sold immediately upon my death. The proceeds divided according to percentages, 40 for Richard, 40 for Michael, and 20 for Claire, as agreed upon by the family. My jewelry, the small things that still held my scent, were itemized with cold precision: gold watch to Melissa, pearl brooch to family of Richard, antique ring to be determined. The note on the margin caught my breath. It wasn't typed, but written in a looping, careless scrawl that looked far too familiar. We can update this after she signs the new one. I read that line over and over, as if the ink itself might offer another meaning, a less cruel translation. But there was none. I could almost hear them in my head, planning, discussing, the way people do when they've convinced themselves they're doing something reasonable. That word again, practical. I folded the papers carefully, not out of sentiment, but out of habit, the way you fold a flag after a funeral. I placed them back where I'd found them, exactly the same, but before I did, I took out my phone and snapped 3 photographs. The soft click of the camera sounded louder than thunder in that quiet kitchen. The kettle began to whistle, and I let it scream longer than necessary before turning it off. My reflection in the window looked older than I remembered. There's something about betrayal that ages you instantly, like rust creeping across metal. I made my tea and stood there sipping it, thinking not about what they'd done, but about how easily they must have justified it. I could almost hear Melissa's voice saying, "She's not good with details. She'll thank us later." I could picture Richard nodding, convincing himself that he was simply taking responsibility, that it was better to keep things in order. I didn't even feel rage yet, just a deep analytical curiosity about when exactly I had stopped being their mother and had become their problem to solve. I dressed slowly that morning, put on the brown cardigan that still smelled faintly of cedar, and sat at my desk in the front room. I took out a pen and a notepad and began to write, not to them, not even to my lawyer yet, but to myself. I wrote down every word I could remember from the night before, every phrase, every tone, every look. The paper filled quickly. As I wrote, I realized something I hadn't before. They hadn't simply planned for my death, they had already rewritten it, edited my absence before it had even arrived. They'd moved me off stage in their minds, clearing space for their own versions of the story. And that, more than the forgery or the greed, was what hurt most, the ease with which they could imagine a world without me. By late morning, I had decided what I would do. Not revenge, not confrontation, just truth, cold, quiet truth. I found the small digital recorder I'd kept in a drawer since my husband's passing, the same one I'd whispered into the night before. I checked the batteries, tested the microphone, and placed it carefully inside a napkin holder on the dining room shelf. Then I went about my day, as if nothing had changed. When Richard called to say they'd be dropping by again in the evening to help clean up, I agreed with a lightness I didn't feel. I even thanked him for being so thoughtful. The hours passed slowly, the kind of slowness that sharpens your senses. I noticed everything, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint crack in the wall where the sunlight caught, the pattern of footsteps approaching the porch. When they arrived, I greeted them with warmth, perhaps even too much. Melissa commented that I seemed cheerful, and I told her it was just gratitude for family, for being together. That was true, in its way. Gratitude can take many forms. We gathered in the kitchen again, reheating leftovers, the smell of turkey returning like an echo. Claire had come alone this time, without her husband. She looked uneasy, glancing between her brothers as though she already sensed something was wrong. The conversation began harmlessly enough, small talk about the meal, about work. Then, as if on cue, Richard produced a manila envelope from his bag. "Mom," he said gently, "I was thinking maybe we could simplify some things while we're all here. You know, just get the paperwork in order. You don't have to sign anything now, but maybe you could take a look." He placed the envelope on the table, sliding it toward me like an offering. I looked at it for a long moment, then smiled. "Of course," I said, my voice steady. I didn't touch it. Instead, I poured everyone tea, moving slowly, deliberately, the way one moves when they're listening, rather than acting. The recorder blinked silently behind the napkins. Melissa leaned forward, all polite concern. "We just want to make sure everything's settled the way you'd want, that no one takes advantage of you later on." Her eyes darted to Richard's, then back to me. "It's not about money," she added quickly. "It's about clarity." Michael shifted uncomfortably in his chair, muttering something about not rushing things, but his voice faded when Richard shot him a look. Claire said nothing, her lips pressed into a thin line. I asked them gentle questions. What exactly had they changed? Who had helped them? Whether they thought I might forget what I had already written. My tone was soft, almost amused, as if we were discussing a recipe gone slightly wrong. The more I stayed calm, the more their certainty began to unravel. At one point, Melissa reached for my hand. "You trust us, don't you?" she said. "We're just thinking of your comfort." I looked at her manicured fingers resting lightly on mine and thought of all the nights I'd sat up sewing her children's Christmas stockings, of the winter I'd lent them money they never repaid. "Of course I trust you," I said. "That's why I'm listening so carefully." She smiled, not realizing the weight of my words. After they left that evening, I sat again at the table, the house quiet, but for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I retrieved the recorder, pressed play, and listened. Every word, every hesitation, every false note of concern poured out in crystal clarity. I heard my own voice, too, calm, patient, precise. It was like listening to ghosts confess. When the recording ended, I felt something shift inside me. Not vengeance, not satisfaction, just a clean, unshakable resolve. They had wanted to plan for my death. I had just documented their intentions. Before going to bed, I called my lawyer, a woman named Sandra who had always spoken to me as if I still mattered. I told her everything, the forged will, the meeting, the recording. She listened without interruption, and when I finished, she exhaled softly. "You did the right thing," she said. "Don't confront them yet. Let's make this official." Her voice was calm, steady, professional, but underneath it, I could hear something else. Respect. She told me to bring the documents and the recording to her office after the weekend. "We'll make sure they understand exactly what they've done," she said. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house seemed to hum with the memory of their voices, the echo of phrases like comfort and clarity and just thinking ahead. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, realizing that the family I thought I still had existed only in my imagination, a fragile photograph already fading. But I wasn't broken. I was awake, and by the time the dawn light seeped through the curtains, I knew that the next chapter of my life would not be written by their hands or their lies. It would be written in my own steady script, and this time it would be signed only by me. The weekend unfolded with that deceptive calm that always follows a storm too quiet to be noticed. I tried to keep to my routines, watering the plants, sweeping the porch, folding laundry that didn't need folding, but everything I touched felt staged, as if I were walking through a museum exhibit of my own life. The sound of the ticking clock in the hallway became unbearable, too deliberate, too aware of itself, as though it were keeping time for someone else's benefit. On Sunday evening, I cooked a small dinner, though I barely ate. I sat by the window long after dark, watching the streetlights flicker across the empty driveway, where their cars had been just 2 nights before. There was something oddly satisfying about that emptiness, like a room exhaling after holding its breath too long. I thought about calling Claire. She was the only one who had looked uneasy, the only one whose silence had seemed like a form of protest. But I knew that if I called, she would soften, and I wasn't ready to be soothed. I needed the ache to stay sharp a little longer, like a splinter that reminds you not to touch the wound too soon. I poured myself a small glass of wine and turned on the recorder again, not to listen this time, but to speak. I began to narrate everything I could remember, the conversation, the tone, the smallest details. It felt strange at first, hearing my own voice so steady, almost detached. But the more I spoke, the more I realized that speaking aloud was an act of reclamation, as though I were dragging my own name back from the grave they had already dug for me. When I finished, I felt lighter, though not yet free. The next morning, I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. There's a particular kind of stillness that comes when grief turns into focus, and I carried that stillness with me as I got dressed. I decided to take a walk through town, the kind of unhurried wandering that used to fill my weekends before my knees began to protest. The air was cold but clean, the kind of cold that keeps your thoughts crisp. I passed the bakery where I used to buy birthday cakes for the children, the park where Richard once lost his first tooth, the library steps where I used to sit with Michael and read aloud until the sun went down. Everywhere I looked, memories moved quietly, like animals you didn't want to startle. It's a strange thing to walk through the geography of your own motherhood and realize how little of it belongs to you now. By the time I reached the lawyer's office that afternoon, I had rehearsed nothing. I didn't need to. Sandra greeted me with that calm professionalism I'd come to rely on. She led me to her office, closed the door, and gestured for me to sit. "You brought the papers?" she asked, and I nodded, placing the envelope on her desk as if it were an offering. She unfolded each page with care, her eyes narrowing slightly as she read. "These are alterations," she said finally, "and poorly disguised ones. Whoever did this assumed you wouldn't notice." I almost laughed at that, though it came out more as a sigh. "They assumed I wouldn't look," I said, "that I'd just sign what was placed in front of me." Sandra looked up, and for a moment I saw not a lawyer, but another woman who understood exactly what it meant to be dismissed by your own blood. "We'll handle this quietly," she said. "I'll contact the notary and verify the original file. We can update your existing will and add a clause that prevents unauthorized access to your estate documents. But I want you to keep that recording safe. Don't delete it." We spoke for nearly an hour, the conversation shifting from legal terms to personal ones, the way it often does when two women sit together long enough. Before I left, Sandra touched my arm gently. "They'll come back," she said. "Maybe not right away, but they will. They always do when money's involved. Be ready." I thanked her and stepped outside into the pale light of late afternoon, my breath clouding in front of me like a small ghost. I didn't feel frightened. I felt awake. When I returned home, I found a message on my answering machine. Richard again, his tone light, rehearsed. "Mom, just checking in. Hope you're resting. Maybe we can stop by this weekend. Help you with that paperwork?" I listened twice, then deleted it. The click of the button felt ceremonial, like sealing a letter you'll never send. That evening, I sat by the window, with the lights off, and watched the neighbors' houses glow in soft yellows and blues. I wondered if anyone in those homes had ever been betrayed so politely. Over the next few days, I began to notice how the world outside seemed indifferent to my private revolution. The mail still arrived, the garbage truck still came on Thursdays, the cat from next door still sat on my porch waiting for milk. But something inside me had shifted permanently. I no longer moved through the house as its caretaker. I moved through it as its owner, conscious of every corner, every wall that had once held the laughter of people who now planned its sale. I began sorting through drawers, not to pack, but to reclaim. I touched each object deliberately, reminding myself what belonged to me. Old letters, photographs, recipe cards written in my mother's hand, things they would have thrown away as clutter. I made piles of what mattered and what didn't, and with each sorted item, I felt a strange, almost defiant calm. One evening, as I was sorting papers in the study, I found an old cassette tape my husband had recorded for me years ago. His voice crackled through the static, warm and unguarded. "If you're listening to this, Elle, it means you're cleaning again instead of resting. Sit down. You've earned a break." I sat, as instructed, and let his voice wash over me. He had always been the pragmatic one, but he also understood me in ways the children never could. I thought about how he'd shake his head if he knew what they had done, not out of disbelief, but disappointment. He'd tell me to protect myself, to stay steady, to be smarter than their greed. And for the first time in years, I realized I was already doing exactly that. The following week brought a subtle escalation, one that felt less like confrontation and more like the tightening of invisible strings. Michael called first, his voice awkward, hesitant. "Mom, I just wanted to make sure you're okay," he said. "Richard mentioned you seemed a little off lately." I could hear the nervousness in him, the good heart that had always made him the least dangerous of the three. I assured him I was fine, better than fine, and before he could ask more, I told him I was busy baking. He seemed relieved to have an excuse to hang up. A few hours later, Melissa called. "We were thinking of visiting this weekend," she said, her tone as smooth as syrup, but just as sticky. "You know, maybe go through some of Dad's things, help you declutter." I let her speak, murmuring polite agreements while jotting down every word. I knew now that their version of help was always a synonym for control. When I hung up, I set another reminder on my phone: record everything. Friday came gray and wet. The house smelled of cinnamon and rain. I decided that if they were coming, I would host them as if it were an ordinary visit, the way one might host tourists in a historic home. I set the table, lit candles, arranged flowers. I wore the red sweater my husband had always loved, not because I wanted to look soft, but because I wanted to look alive. When the doorbell rang, I didn't hesitate. They entered with that mixture of politeness and tension that only families carry. Smiles stretched too wide, voices pitched too high. Richard kissed my cheek, coldly. Melissa commented on how well I looked, as if she were surprised I still had color in my face. Claire stood back, watching, her eyes full of questions she didn't dare ask. We sat in the living room, making small talk, while the rain pattered against the windows. Richard eventually cleared his throat, the universal sign that the real conversation was about to begin. "Mom, we've been thinking," he started. "It might be easier if we help you manage your accounts. You know, bills, maintenance, all that. It can be overwhelming at your age." His tone was sugar-coated, but the meaning was sharp. I nodded, listening, every nerve calm and alert. "That's kind," I said, "but I've been managing quite well." Melissa leaned forward, eyes bright. "We just don't want you to be taken advantage of, that's all." I smiled. "I already was," I said quietly, "but I've learned." They didn't know what to make of that, and for a moment no one spoke. Claire was the first to break the silence. "Mom, maybe they're just worried," she said softly. "It's been a tough year." Her voice trembled, but her eyes held mine, and I saw in them not complicity, but fear. The kind of fear that comes from watching a family fracture and knowing it can't be undone. I reached across the table and touched her hand briefly. "Don't worry about me," I said. "I'm stronger than I look." After they left, the house felt lighter, almost empty of their shadows. I sat on the couch and played back the new recording, their voices muffled by the rain, but clear enough. When Richard said, "It might be easier if we help you manage," I heard it differently this time, not as a threat, but as confirmation. They were still assuming I was predictable, still thinking of me as manageable. They had no idea that their every word now lived in a digital archive, preserved not out of vengeance, but out of love for the truth. That night, as I turned off the lights and walked slowly up the stairs, I felt something rise in me that had been dormant for decades. Not anger, not triumph, but a quiet, disciplined kind of power. The kind that comes when a woman realizes no one is coming to save her, and that she doesn't need saving anyway. I paused at the top step and looked back at the darkened rooms below, at the home that had witnessed everything: births, arguments, laughter, silence, and now this long, slow unveiling of truth. It looked different now, not smaller, not lonelier, just honest. And as I stepped into my bedroom, I whispered to the empty air, "You should never have mistaken my silence for consent." Then I smiled, turned out the light, and slept deeply for the first time in years. The days that followed felt suspended, like the house and I were breathing together in long, measured intervals, waiting for something neither of us could yet name. The silence had changed. It was no longer heavy but watchful, a silence that listened with me rather than to me. I moved through my rooms as if reintroduced to them, noticing things I had once ignored. The soft groan of the floorboards, the faint smell of lemon oil from the furniture, the light that bent differently across the hallway mirror, depending on the hour. It was strange how, when you strip away the noise of other people's expectations, the world grows clearer, almost tender. My husband had always said I filled a room with energy, but now I realized it had never been my energy they felt. It was my restraint, the invisible labor of keeping peace, smoothing edges, making others comfortable. Without that effort, there was just me, unmasked, unhurried, precise. On Tuesday morning, I woke earlier than usual, stirred by the thought that I could finally act without explanation. I made coffee, sat by the kitchen window, and took out my notebook, where I had begun to collect the fragments of the life I was reclaiming. Each page contained details, not of revenge, but of remembrance. The dates of their visits, the words they used, the gestures they didn't realize betrayed them. I wasn't building a case, though it might have looked that way. I was building a mirror. People like my children rarely look at themselves closely unless someone holds the reflection steady. I intended to hold it steady until they could no longer pretend not to see. By midday, I had decided that action did not have to be loud to be final. I called Sandra again and told her I wanted to revise my will immediately, not just to correct their tampering, but to shift its entire meaning. I want to leave the house to something that breathes, I said, not to people who calculate square footage while the turkey's still warm. She hesitated, perhaps surprised by the calmness of my tone. You mean a charity? She asked. Yes, I said, but not just any. I wanted to go to a place where women my age can live safely, away from families who decide their worth, somewhere clean, quiet, and dignified. A refuge for those who outlive their usefulness in other people's eyes. There was silence on the line, and then a long, slow exhale. I'll make it happen, she said. After the call, I felt an unexpected lightness, not joy exactly, but something close to relief. For years, I had been haunted by the question of legacy, what I would leave behind, what would prove that I had existed. I used to think it was my children, my family, the traditions I held together like threads in a fraying cloth. But now I saw it differently. Legacy isn't who remembers you. It's what remains honest when the remembering stops. That afternoon, the sky turned a dull pewter gray, and I decided to take another walk, this time into town. I needed to move, to feel the rhythm of my feet against the pavement, to remind myself that I was still capable of motion, of choosing direction. The air smelled of damp earth and the faint sweetness of bakery yeast. Passing the cafe on Main Street, I stopped at the window and caught sight of a familiar figure. Arthur, the widower who lived 2 streets down, the one who always waved when I collected my mail. He was sitting alone with a book and a cup of coffee, his shoulders slightly hunched in that way men have when they've been carrying silence too long. On impulse, I went in. He looked up, surprised, and smiled the kind of smile that asks no questions. Eleanor, he said, I was just thinking of you. I saw your lights on late last night. Couldn't sleep? I laughed softly and sat across from him. You could say that, I replied. Too many thoughts, not enough air. He nodded as if he understood entirely, and for a while we spoke about simple things, the weather, the ridiculous price of coffee, how autumn seemed shorter every year. But beneath the small talk, there was a thread of recognition, that unspoken kinship between people who have been quietly disappointed by those they loved most. When I mentioned that my children had been visiting often, he smiled knowingly. Mine too, when there's paperwork involved. We sat for nearly an hour, and when I left, he handed me a folded napkin. "For when you forget to breathe," he said. Inside, he had written a quote in neat block letters. "Freedom begins where expectation ends." It was a small thing, but I tucked it carefully into my coat pocket, feeling as though the universe had conspired to remind me that I wasn't as alone as I thought. When I returned home, there was a letter waiting in the mailbox, postmarked from another city. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the return address was my lawyer's office. Inside was a printed confirmation of the revised will, a summary of the new beneficiaries, and a brief note in Sandra's handwriting. "Everything is in motion. Keep steady. They'll know soon enough." I sat at the kitchen table reading it over and over until the words blurred. For the first time in months, I felt that the story was shifting, not toward chaos, but toward clarity. That evening, I decided to record another message, not for myself this time, but for whoever would listen after I was gone. I placed the recorder on the table, pressed the red button, and began to speak. My voice came out low, almost tender. I told the truth plainly, without bitterness. I spoke of the house, of the years spent within its walls, of the love that had lived here before it curdled into obligation. I spoke of my husband and his laughter, of my children and their ambition, of the invisible years that mothers give away without keeping a receipt. I ended with a line that came to me without effort. "You can inherit a house, but not a conscience." When I stopped the recording, I didn't play it back. Some truths are best left to exist unexamined, pure in their first utterance. The next morning, the phone rang just after breakfast. It was Claire. Her voice was small, almost childlike. "Mom," she said, "I don't know what's happening between you and Richard, but he's been different. He keeps saying we have to get things in order. I told him to stop, that it's cruel, but he doesn't listen." I closed my eyes, picturing her as a girl again, the way she used to defend stray animals from her brothers. "You did the right thing," I said gently, "and you don't need to fix this. Just stay kind. That's all I ask." She started to cry, quietly, like someone trying not to wake a sleeping baby. "He's going to be angry," she whispered. "Let him be," I said. "Anger is just guilt that learned to shout." After the call, I brewed a fresh pot of coffee and stood by the window as the first snow of the season began to fall. The flakes drifted lazily, indifferent to everything, covering the yard like a soft surrender. I thought of how many winters this house had seen, how many times I'd looked out this same window waiting for someone to come home. But now there was no waiting, only watching. The difference felt immense. Around noon, I heard a car pull into the driveway. My heart gave a small start, then settled. I didn't need to look to know it was Richard. He didn't knock. He never did when he believed he owned a space. He walked in calling my name, his voice too loud for the quiet. "Mom, you here?" I met him in the hallway, wiping my hands on a towel. "Of course," I said. "You could have called first." He smiled, that patronizing half-smile that had once charmed teachers and neighbors. "Just wanted to check on you," he said. "I was in the area." We both knew that was a lie. He looked around, eyes scanning the room, perhaps expecting to find new papers, new evidence of his control slipping. "Everything all right?" he asked. "Perfectly," I said. "I've been busy making plans." The word seemed to catch him off guard. "Plans?" "Yes," I said. "For winter. It's time to make things comfortable." He nodded, pretending to understand. but his eyes darted toward my desk, the one where I kept my documents. He stayed only 15 minutes, long enough to mention that Melissa thought I should reconsider certain decisions. I smiled and told him I already had. When he finally left, I stood at the window, watching his car disappear into the gray distance, a small figure swallowed by the falling snow. I didn't feel triumphant, only certain. He would go back to his life, to his conversations about property and fairness, unaware that the ground beneath him had already shifted. That night, I baked a pie just for myself, apple with too much cinnamon. I ate it warm, sitting at the table by the dim light of the lamp, feeling a kind of peace I hadn't known in years. Outside, the snow deepened, softening every edge. Inside, the air was thick with sugar and memory. For the first time since the betrayal began, I understood that survival isn't always about fighting back. Sometimes it's about outlasting, about letting the others exhaust themselves in their schemes while you quietly rewrite the ending. I didn't need to raise my voice. I had already begun to speak in a language they could no longer hear. I didn't expect the article. That was the moment I understood they were not just careless or greedy or thoughtless. They were willing to rearrange reality in public if it meant keeping control of what they'd quietly decided belonged to them. It came 3 weeks after the snow, in a thin local paper I'd stopped reading years ago, folded neatly in my mailbox like any other bit of junk. I almost tossed it straight into the recycling, but a small square photograph on the bottom half of the front page caught my eye. It was an old picture of me, taken at some long-ago church fundraiser, holding a pie and smiling in that polite way I'd forgotten I used to have. Above it, in bold letters that managed to sound both tragic and theatrical, were the words, "Family seeks answers in elderly mother's withdrawal." They'd made me into a story, not a woman, a story. I stood on the porch reading, the cold air creeping under my sleeves while my coffee cooled on the railing. The article was written in that syrupy tone journalists use when they want to sound compassionate without understanding a thing. It talked about how my children were deeply concerned that I had become isolated and confused since my husband's death, how they feared I'd been influenced into making sudden changes to my will. Richard was quoted as saying, "We just want to protect her legacy. Mom isn't herself lately." Melissa, never one to miss a performance, had contributed too. She's always been so generous. That's why it breaks our hearts to see her pushing us away. I could almost hear the rehearsed tremor in her voice. There was a line that made my hand clench around the paper. "We worry someone may be taking advantage of her emotionally and financially." No names, of course, just a suggestion, a fog of suspicion cast deliberately vague. It wasn't enough to imply I was incompetent. They had to imply I was a victim of someone else's manipulation. They couldn't imagine a world where I was simply done with theirs. I went back inside, laid the paper flat on the kitchen table, and read it again slowly. At first I laughed, a short disbelieving sound that startled even me. Then beneath the amusement came a wave of something heavier. Not hurt, not even anger exactly, but a deep insult to my intelligence. They hadn't confronted me. They'd gone sideways, building a narrative for strangers, testing how it looked in print before bringing it to my face. I recognized the tactic. I'd watched Richard do it his whole life, rewriting history in social tones so polished that people thanked him for the lie. I traced my finger along the line about confusion, remembering the previous week when I'd sat in Sandra's office and read aloud, without hesitating, the clause that left my home to the women's refuge. Confusion indeed. I made myself breakfast, not because I was hungry, but because ritual keeps the blood from boiling. 2 eggs, toast, a slice of the pie I'd baked just for myself. I ate it all deliberately, as if proving something to my own hands. When I was done, I put the paper in a clear plastic sleeve and filed it in the same folder as the recordings and the forged draft of the will. It belonged there, another artifact of how far they were willing to go. Then I called Sandra. She'd already seen it. "They're posturing," she said calmly, "testing a narrative in case they want to contest your will later. Or worse, file for guardianship." I felt my jaw tighten at the word. Guardianship. As if I were a child misplacing her lunchbox. "Can they?" I asked. "They can try," she answered, "but they'll have to prove you're not of sound mind, and everything you've done so far shows the opposite. Still, we're going to shore this up. I'd like you to schedule a capacity evaluation with an independent doctor on the record, voluntarily. We document everything. We don't wait to defend. We build the wall now." She didn't say it dramatically. She didn't have to. It sounded less like a war plan and more like a housekeeping list, which I appreciated. I agreed. It felt like getting my vaccinations before flu season. A few days later, just as the ice began to thaw along the gutters, they escalated properly, no longer hiding behind print. Richard came first, with his knock that was really an announcement. I opened the door, and there he was, in his careful coat, with a man standing beside him, holding a briefcase and a face like stale bread. "Mom," Richard said, "this is Daniel Cohen. He's helped some of my colleagues with family planning. He just wants to chat, make sure you're protected." I looked at the stranger. He smiled in that precise way lawyers do when they're waiting to see who in the room has teeth. I held the door open wider. "Well, you've both come all this way," I said. "Come in. I was just making tea." I wasn't, but I enjoy setting the table on my terms. I led them to the dining room, the same table where they'd once mapped out my absence between bites of turkey. The recorder was already on the shelf behind me, its little eye unblinking. We sat. Richard spoke first, faux casual. "Mom, we saw that you made some changes. It's okay, we get it. Grief makes people do sudden things. But we thought it would be wise to have another professional opinion, just to be fair." The lawyer cleared his throat. "Mrs. Mayfield, I'm sure your attorney is competent, but sometimes family situations are complex. Your children only want to support you." He said it smoothly, but his eyes flicked toward Richard, checking if he was earning his fee. I let them talk. I let them circle, using words like stability and vulnerability and clarity, all of which apparently meant sign the papers we prefer. When they paused, I folded my hands on the table. "I appreciate your concern," I said slowly. "Let me be very clear so there is no misunderstanding. The will on record is my decision, made with full capacity, reviewed line by line with my lawyer, whom I chose and trust. I am not confused. I am not coerced. I am not lost." I held Daniel Cohen's gaze until he looked away. Richard shifted, annoyed. "No one said you were lost, Mom. You're putting words in our mouths," he said, his charm fraying. "We just want to be sure you're not being pressured by outside parties." Outside parties. I almost smiled. "The only pressure I feel," I said, "is from the people sitting in my dining room, implying that I don't know my own mind." There was a flicker in his eyes then, a flash of something spiteful and young. The same boy who'd once broken a neighbor's window and sworn it had been an accident right up until I found the rocks in his pockets. "We're trying to help you," he snapped. "Your decisions affect all of us." That was it. The confession. My decisions. Their expectations. There, finally, without varnish. I leaned forward slightly. No, I said very softly. My decisions affect me. Your expectations affect you. That is not the same thing. Daniel Cohen cleared his throat again. Perhaps we should revisit this another time, he said. He was smart enough to recognize a woman who would not sign on command. Richard stood, his chair scraping too loudly. This isn't over, he said, not looking at me. It never is, I replied. When they left, I locked the door, not out of fear, but because I liked the sound of the bolt sliding home. Then I sat down and listened to the recording. Not to enjoy it, but to witness it, to anchor myself against the doubt they kept trying to plant like weeds in my mind. The next call came from Michael. His voice was strained, thinner than usual. "Mom, what are you doing?" he asked without greeting. "Richard says you've left everything to strangers, that you're shutting us out." I exhaled slowly, recognizing the tremor, not malice, but panic. "I haven't left anything to strangers," I said. "I've left my home to women who need one, and I haven't shut you out. You all stepped back the moment I stopped handing things over." He tried clumsily to bridge the gap. "We're family," he said. "That's supposed to mean something." "It does," I answered. "That's why this hurts, but it doesn't entitle you to my bones." There was quiet on the line, then a soft, defeated, "He's going to push this," meaning Richard, meaning guardianship, lawsuits, smear campaigns, whatever tool made him feel like the responsible one. "Let him push," I said. "The ground is firmer on my side." Michael didn't argue. He never could, not with me. He only said, "I'm sorry," and hung up. And for the first time since all this began, I allowed myself a brief, private grief for the boy in him who might have chosen differently if he'd been braver. They tried another angle next, concern disguised as surveillance. Melissa started showing up unannounced to help, arriving with reusable grocery bags and a quick, assessing glance around the house. She opened cabinets without asking, peered at pill bottles, rearranged things that didn't need rearranging. "You shouldn't be on that step stool," she scolded when she saw me reach for a bowl. "You know falls are the leading cause of injury at your age." At my age. I stepped down carefully, not because she told me to, but because I didn't intend to give her the satisfaction of being right if I cracked my skull. "Melissa," I said, "I've fallen harder than this family ever will, and I'm still standing." She laughed, assuming I was making some quaint joke. I did not correct her. One afternoon, she arrived with a folder of brochures. Retirement homes, assisted living facilities, communities with smiling models on balconies holding coffee mugs. She spread them out on my table like menu options. "Just to consider," she said lightly. "Wonderful amenities, full medical support, lots of activities. You'd make friends." I looked at the glossy pages, the staged old women playing cards, the men in pressed vests. "I already have a house," I said. She gave me a look of exaggerated patience. "Yes, but for how much longer can you maintain it? Think of the burden." There it was again, the burden. My existence weighed against their convenience. I picked up one brochure, examined it closely, then placed it back in the stack. "If I go somewhere," I said, "it won't be because you cleared a shelf for me. It'll be mine, on my terms." She didn't like that answer. I saw the flicker of irritation pass across her perfect face. She gathered the brochures too quickly, as if they'd betrayed her by failing to persuade me on sight. Behind all their efforts, something else was brewing, and I felt it before I saw it. People at church started asking carefully phrased questions. "Are you managing all right, Eleanor? We heard you've been a bit withdrawn." One woman, who'd always envied my hydrangeas, leaned in and asked, "Is it true you're thinking of Giving the house away? The way she said it, as if I'd proposed throwing a child into a river. I smiled, the kind of gentle smile that had disarmed gossip for decades. I'm thinking of cleaning up, I said, starting with other people's assumptions. She didn't know what to do with that, so she laughed and pretended it was a joke. But I could feel the ripple. My children had been talking to others, planting seeds about the problem of me. The performance in the paper was only the first act. I told Sandra everything. She listened, took notes, and finally said what we both already knew. They're building a narrative of incompetence, she said. So we'll keep building the opposite. I've scheduled your evaluation for next week. 2 independent doctors. Once that's on record, any attempt at guardianship is going to look exactly like what it is. I asked her what that was, exactly, knowing but wanting it named. She didn't hesitate. Financial abuse, she said, or an attempt at it. You're not their vessel, Eleanor. It's a simple sentence, but hearing someone with authority articulate what I'd felt in my bones, settled me in a way nothing else had. The examination was almost comically thorough. Memory tests, orientation questions, logic puzzles I'd been giving to students back when I volunteered at the library's reading program. I answered calmly, occasionally with more detail than required. The doctor, a woman younger than my youngest, smiled at the end. You're more lucid than half the people who send emails at 3 a.m, she said. I'll send the report this week. Walking out of that office into the bright, indifferent daylight, I felt like someone who'd quietly passed a test the others were certain she'd fail. It wasn't pride. It was vindication without spectacle. Back at home, the air in the house felt thicker, charged. Something in the storyline had shifted, and I knew somehow they'd feel it too, even before the paperwork reached them. That evening, I invited Arthur for tea. We sat in the living room, the lamplight warm, the house smelling faintly of lemon and old books. I told him in broad strokes what had been happening, not every detail, but enough. He listened without interruption, his face growing still. My sons tried something like that, he said finally. Didn't get as far as yours. I scared them with a lawyer and a locked file cabinet, but they were thinking it. We sat together in the shared, quiet understanding of that sentence. I didn't cry. He didn't tell me to forgive. We just existed in that honest place where old people admit that sometimes the children they raised grow into strangers with familiar eyes. Before he left, he took my hand firmly and said, "If they come after you, you call me. I'll sit in the room. Sometimes they behave better with witnesses." I laughed, but later that night, looking at the stack of evidence I'd assembled, recordings, documents, the newspaper article, notes in my careful handwriting, I realized I already had witnesses. My past, my mind, my choices lined up in order. They had escalation. I had record. And record is patient. It doesn't shout. It doesn't demand. It simply waits for the moment when someone says, "Prove it," and then answers without blinking. It happened on a Sunday, a day that had always pretended to mean rest, but never truly delivered it. The sky had the brittle shine of early March, that deceptive brightness that makes you think warmth is returning when it's only the light playing tricks. I had been up since dawn, not from nerves, but from habit. When you spend your life anticipating others' needs, your body forgets how to be idle. The kettle whistled, the radiator sighed, and the house stretched itself awake like an old cat. I'd known the day would come, though not exactly when. There had been signs, short-clipped emails from Richard, 2 voicemails from an unknown number that turned out to be a paralegal, a certified letter with my name printed too neatly. its contents both expected and insulting. They had filed for guardianship. My own children, citing concerns for cognitive decline and undue influence. The letter ended with a hearing date, March 17th. I remember thinking how tidy that sounded, how much they loved to give betrayal a calendar square. I went to the courthouse alone. Sandra offered to come, of course, but I wanted to see their faces unmediated, to hear how they would frame the story of me while I was still sitting upright in the same room. I dressed carefully, the way I used to when meeting my husband's clients. Dark skirt, pressed blouse, the cameo he'd given me on our 20th anniversary. I pinned my hair back, added lipstick, and looked at myself in the mirror. The woman there was not frail. She looked alert, precise, almost serene. The trick, I told myself, is not to outtalk them. It's to outweight them. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, a muted space with scuffed benches and air that smelled faintly of polish and anxiety. My children sat together at one table, a perfect tableau of familial concern. Melissa wore black, of course, the universal color of seriousness. Richard had papers spread before him like a man defending a thesis. Claire was pale, twisting a handkerchief, avoiding my gaze. Michael looked ill, his shoulders hunched as though he already regretted being there. Opposite them, a thin woman with neat glasses introduced herself as the court-appointed evaluator. I nodded politely. The judge, an older man with the calm weariness of someone who's seen too many family dramas, dressed up as altruism, called the hearing to order. Richard began. His voice was steady, practiced, the same tone he used when speaking at fundraisers. "Your Honor," he said, "we're here because we love our mother. She's always been independent, but lately her behavior has raised concerns. She's become reclusive, dismissive of family contact, and has made sudden, uncharacteristic financial decisions under what we believe may be outside influence." He gestured gracefully, as if presenting evidence of the weather. "We only want to ensure her safety and that her estate is managed responsibly." The judge nodded, eyes half-lidded. "You're alleging incapacity." Richard shifted slightly, perhaps realizing the gravity of the word. "Not incapacity exactly," he said smoothly. "Just confusion, decline." He used the word like a physician diagnosing someone else's patient. Melissa chimed in with a tremor in her voice, describing how I'd grown distant, how I forgot appointments, how I was easily overwhelmed. None of it was outright false, which made it more insidious. There's always a grain of truth in a successful lie. I do forget appointments sometimes. I've earned that right. I am easily overwhelmed by their arrogance, their assumption that affection entitles ownership. When they finished, the judge turned to me. "Mrs. Mayfield," he said, "you can speak now, or your attorney can do so on your behalf." I smiled. "I'll speak for myself." My voice, when it came, was calm, measured, almost tender. "Your Honor, my children are correct about one thing. I have changed, but not in the way they describe. I've become quieter, yes, but that's not confusion. It's discernment. I've withdrawn from noise, not from life. The decisions I've made are deliberate, documented, and motivated by experience, not decline." I reached into my bag and pulled out the neatly bound folder Sandra had prepared. The medical evaluations, the notarized statements, the updated will. I handed it to the clerk. "You'll find there 2 independent assessments of full mental capacity. You'll also find audio recordings dated from last November, in which these same children discuss how best to alter my estate before my death." The room shifted then, the air turning dense. Richard's face drained of color, though he tried to recover quickly. "She's been manipulated," he said sharply. Someone's feeding her this. The judge raised a hand. Mr. Mayfield, you'll wait until she finishes. I continued, still soft but unflinching. They thought I wouldn't notice a forged document left in my own kitchen. They thought they could discuss my will over dinner, forgetting that I know what silence can do when it's given a microphone. I recorded nothing secretly, Your Honor. They were in my home, speaking freely. I simply listened. I looked directly at Richard then, not with anger, but with that slow, maternal disappointment that lands harder than rage. It's strange, isn't it? How children forget their mothers can still learn. The evaluator, to her credit, looked uncomfortable. She adjusted her glasses, glanced at the folder, and whispered something to the judge. He nodded slowly, then asked if I wanted the recordings played. I said yes. There's a kind of power in letting people hear their own cruelty out loud. It strips away the charm they've built around it. The clerk set up the small speaker, pressed play, and the room filled with the Thanksgiving voices I knew too well. The conversation was mundane at first, cutlery clinking, polite laughter. But then came the lines that had branded themselves into my memory. We can't wait forever. She won't even notice the changes. It's not about money. It's about control. My children's words, casual and venomous, echoing through the courtroom like ghosts refusing to stay buried. When the recording ended, no one spoke for several seconds. The judge leaned back, his face expressionless, though the silence itself was a verdict. Finally, he said, I've heard enough. His voice carried the tired authority of someone whose faith in decency had been eroded one family at a time. The petition for guardianship is denied. I find no evidence of incapacity, confusion, or undue influence. On the contrary, Mrs. Mayfield appears more lucid than most of us here. There was a faint murmur in the room, part relief, part shame. The judge wasn't finished. However, he added, turning toward my children, I strongly suggest you reconsider how you define care. What I've heard today is not protection. It's possession. Richard started to speak, but the judge's gavel struck once, sharp enough to end the conversation. We're done, he said. The sound echoed long after he'd risen. Outside, the air smelled of thawing earth, the first hint of mud beneath melting snow. I walked down the courthouse steps alone, the folder tucked under my arm, and for the first time in months, I felt my spine lengthen, my shoulders loosen. I was not triumphant. Triumph is too loud, too theatrical. What I felt was steadiness, the quiet recalibration of balance after a long tilt. My children stood by their car, a cluster of expensive coats and wounded pride. Claire's eyes met mine for a brief second. Apology flickered there, fragile and real, but I didn't stop. Melissa was talking rapidly to Richard, who ignored her. Michael looked at the ground. I passed them without a word. When I reached the corner, Arthur's car was waiting. He'd insisted on driving me, though I'd told him I could take a cab. He rolled down the window, smiling faintly. All finished? He asked. For now, I said. He nodded. You look lighter. I laughed softly. That's what happens when you put down the dead weight of other people's expectations. We drove in silence for a while, the radio murmuring something about rain later in the week. As the town receded behind us, I realized I no longer needed to check the rearview mirror. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and opened my notebook, the same one I'd filled with careful notes, dates, and fragments of thought. I tore out the first few pages. Anger has its purpose, but it doesn't need an archive, and wrote a single new sentence at the top of a fresh sheet. I am the custodian of my own life, and the record stands. The rest I left blank, deliberately, not because I didn't know what came next, but because blankness, for the first time in decades, felt like possibility rather than emptiness. Around midnight, I stepped outside into the yard. The air was crisp, the moon caught in the branches of the old maple tree. I stood there for a long time, listening to the faint hum of distant traffic, the occasional bark of a dog, the quiet breathing of a world that had moved on without me and would again. I thought of all the versions of myself that had lived in this house, the young wife, the cautious mother, the silent observer, and felt them gather around me, not as regrets, but as witnesses. They had all done their part to bring me here. Inside, on the counter, the recorder's red light still blinked, steady as a heartbeat. I left it on. Some truths deserve to keep recording. Even after the story has finished speaking, the sea became my clock. It told me when to rise, when to rest, when to remember. After the hearing, after the noise and the public shame that my children had brought upon themselves, I packed what I wanted, very little, and left the house on Rosewood Avenue. I did not sell it. I signed the final transfer papers with Sandra, who handled everything quietly, and the property became what I dreamed it might, a home for women my age who had nowhere else to go, who'd been told, as I once was, that they'd outlived their usefulness. It's strange how the same walls that had heard deceit and calculation now hold soft laughter and the smell of bread baking. Sometimes when I visit, the women call me Mrs. Mayfield, with a respect I never asked for, but accept kindly. I tell them to use my first name, Eleanor. They smile and never do. Respect, once offered freely, is too rare to refuse. My own life has narrowed beautifully. I rent a small cottage on the edge of the coast, a place where the floorboards sigh when I walk and the windows catch the morning light in a way that makes even silence look inhabited. I wake before dawn and sit by the window, watching the horizon bruise from gray to gold. Some mornings I hear the church bells from the town half a mile away, and their faint rhythm reminds me that time, like forgiveness, doesn't ask permission before moving on. Arthur visits on Sundays. He brings newspapers, oranges, sometimes a new book. We sit together without needing to fill the space. He never mentions the trial, and I never ask about his sons. That silence is its own peace. In the first weeks after the hearing, I expected anger to find me again, to come knocking like a stray dog that never learned it wasn't welcome. But it didn't. What came instead was an odd gratitude, a slow, mature understanding that not every wound requires closure, some only require air. The past became like a room I'd tidied thoroughly. Nothing left to trip over, only clean emptiness where I could breathe. Sometimes I walk along the shore and talk softly to the wind. Not prayers exactly, but acknowledgments. I tell my husband that the house is safe now, that his work and mine won't be gutted for profit. I tell my children, though they're far away and will never hear, that I hope they grow into gentler versions of themselves, ones who understand that love isn't a contract and inheritance isn't proof of worth. Claire wrote once, a long letter, shaky in handwriting but steady in tone. She said she had moved out of the city, that she'd started painting again, that she was sorry, not just for what happened in court, but for all the times she'd chosen silence because it was easier. She ended by saying, "You were right to keep records, Mom. We never saw you as someone who could. That was our first mistake." I folded that letter and placed it in the same drawer as my marriage certificate. Both, in their own ways, are documents of truth. The others haven't written. I don't expect them to. People who build their lives on denial rarely risk words. Words have edges, and truth cuts. I've learned to accept their absence not as loss, but as space reclaimed. The community trust sends me updates sometimes, letters with photographs of the women who now live in what used to be my home. They've painted the walls pale green. There are geraniums in the front windows and a vegetable garden where the children once played. Each photograph feels like proof that transformation can be quiet and still be complete. They've named the place Haven House, though I suggested nothing. It suits it, a house where the air no longer carries whispers about property or fear, but the smell of stew, laughter, and the clicking of knitting needles. The first winter they moved in, they sent a card signed by everyone. It read simply, "You gave us back the dignity of a locked door." I cried for the first time in many months, not out of sorrow, but because I understood what it meant to build safety out of the ruins of deceit. My days now are filled with small, deliberate tasks. I keep a journal, though I no longer record grievances or dates. Instead, I write about clouds, about the sound of the waves, about the texture of my own solitude. Solitude has texture. It isn't smooth like loneliness. It's grainy, layered, full of quiet surprises. Sometimes I bake and bring loaves to the women's shelter in town, where the younger volunteers insist on carrying the baskets for me. They call me Miss Ellie, as if trimming my name could make me lighter, and perhaps it does. In the afternoons, I nap in a chair by the window, and when I wake, the sea is always different. It changes shape, color, even smell, but it never lies. You can trust the sea, to be honest, even when it's violent. At night, I sit by the lamp and listen to the recordings one last time. Not all of them, just the first one, the Thanksgiving recording. It no longer hurts. It sounds distant, like a radio station from another country. I hear the voices, the laughter, the coded cruelty, and I no longer shrink. I even smile sometimes, thinking how carefully they spoke, how certain they were that I wasn't listening. I let the recording play until the end, until my own quiet voice enters, barely audible over the clatter of dishes. I say, "Let's begin." Those were my first words on the record. I didn't know then that they were also a prophecy. I began that night, not vengeance, not defiance, but the long, steady act of reclaiming myself. When I finish listening, I turn off the device and place it back in the drawer. The red light blinks once, then fades. I leave it there, resting beside the letter from Claire, the cameo, and a few seashells I've gathered from the shore. Objects that mean nothing to anyone else, but feel alive with continuity. I used to think legacy was something you passed down. Now I know it's something you leave behind without apology. The rest belongs to time. Before bed, I open the window to let in the salt air. The wind moves through the room, carrying the faint echo of waves and something almost like music. I close my eyes and breathe it in deeply. I am no one's burden now, no one's mother in the practical sense, no one's property or proof of goodness. I am simply a woman who told the truth and stayed long enough to see it hold. And sometimes, when I think of the women who will live and sleep under that old roof on Rosewood Avenue, I whisper a blessing, not for them, but for every woman who still believes silence will protect her. I whisper, record it, speak it, keep it safe. Then I switch off the light, and the sea keeps time for me until morning.